Hello, welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host, Marie Kato. The season of summits is upon us. G7 leaders gather in France on Monday, June 15th, with a packed agenda. And less than a month after that, a highly anticipated NATO Ankara summit will follow. In the meantime, we'll have heads of state meeting in all sorts of configurations, going through similar urgent agendas. Undoubtedly, support and peace in Ukraine will be a key item. For now, I'd like to discuss how recent developments might be a stepping stone to reaching decisive goals this summer. I'm now joined by James Batchik, Associate Director at the Atlantic Council. Hello, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So to begin with, I wanted to ask you how you think Ukraine intends to conduct negotiations regarding its accession to the European Union, probably one of the most recent developments that we've seen this week.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I would say I think it's a little bit uncertain. It's still to be seen. It's very early on, and unless something pretty drastically changes in the near term, I think accession is still pretty far away. We're seeing a flurry of new proposals and ideas come in when it comes to enlargement. There's a so-called special track of talks for Ukraine, as well as other ideas floated by the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, for example, for Ukraine or others to be this, associate member into the European Union, which would limit its voting rights but integrate into some of the European Union bodies. I think you can look at this two ways. First, I think there's some legitimate frustration from the Ukrainian side that these ideas might be considered half measures, or that any of these partial enlargement ideas might be the de facto stopping point for Ukraine, which would certainly not be ideal. So people, I think, are right to be skeptical of that, given how politically fraught we should keep in mind that enlargement has been in the past and currently is. However, I think that said, it's still worth engaging with these plans. There are some real benefits to some of the plans that are floating around here with regard to enlargement or integration into certain EU policies. For example, the associate member plan has ideas of integration into the EU bodies like the Parliament or the Council, even without voting rights. I think that still allows Ukraine access to a couple of interesting ideas that could really help with its integration into the European Union. I think the biggest point here, though, is that the fact of the matter is, regardless of what anyone says, the current system of enlargement just is not working. The last country to enter the EU was Croatia back in 2013. No other countries have joined since then, and Croatia's membership accession took 10 years. Now, and even the recent episodes we've seen from Ukraine's process since 2022, this has just way too many hurdles and roadblocks to be realistic, I think. And from a transatlantic perspective, I think it's a very good idea to move forward with these creative solutions that are currently out there or might be in the future for Ukraine. EU membership is, I think, much easier to achieve for Ukraine than NATO membership is, for example. And that membership, I think, would be quite important for Ukraine in any sort of peace deal that we might see come up in the near term. So right now, I think it's most important that neither side say no to any sort of discussions on creative ideas regarding enlargement.
Well, you've piqued my interest with a lot of things that you've said there in regards to how EU membership actually progresses. I'm sure we won't be able to cover everything there. But in terms of this special track accession process, do you think that as much as it may have its disadvantages, do you think that that perhaps might be enough for, I say enough in inverted commas, for Ukraine? So it is admitted in some capacity without all the voting rights that it wants, because it allows it to be in that European family and perhaps gives it a little bit of additional leeway when it comes to European support during this war.
Yeah, I'm not going to speak for the Ukrainians as to what they will or will not want. I'd have to defer to the government of Ukraine and also the people of Ukraine for what exactly they would want when any sort of membership or accession comes up to a referendum. But I generally would be supportive of these creative ideas that are out there regarding integration. I think what we're seeing, if you integrate into the European family and the bodies of the European Union, the Commission, the Council, the Parliament, you start to see how the process inside the European Union bodies really start to work, and I think that's an invaluable addition. I think also there are some interesting proposals out there about reverse enlargement or providing Ukraine access to the single market as it closes. potential chapters as things go on. And I think that would be enormously beneficial to the Ukrainian economy, to the Ukrainian people. So I do think it is a valuable proposition, but again, it's a decision that the Ukrainian people will have to make for themselves.
Well, how do you see that vis-a-vis the situation regarding the levels of corruption and disorder that essentially are getting in the way of many things in Ukraine, and I think essentially will get in the way of any sort of broader membership in the European family? I'm referring to the Yermak case and
Right. I mean,
many other cases that we probably aren't aware of at the moment.
sure. No, corruption is of course an issue that many people are watching. It is an issue that will need to be addressed. You've seen the staff from the European Commission working on enlargement call it out and say that this does need to be addressed. But you're also noting that there is progress made on rule of law in corruption issues. And I'm actually quite bullish on the people of Ukraine here. We can keep in mind that these examples of recent corruption cases, for example, that we saw the Ukrainian people come out into the streets during a time of war to push back against their government on some of these cases. And this harkens back to 2014, over 10 years ago now, what's kicked off the revolution of dignity in the Maidan, and in many cases, Ukraine's more advanced movement toward the West was a complete frustration with corruption inside the country. So yes, it is a topic that does need to be worked on. I'm confident that many inside the commission as well will be focusing heavily on this, but as well as the people of Ukraine, and rightly so.
Well, you keep mentioning the people of Ukraine. So can I ask you, what do the people of Ukraine want when it comes to ending this war and how they want it ended? I assume you've spoken to many people from Ukraine.
Sure. So I would say I'm in Washington D.C., so I'm not in Ukraine. But I think what the people of Ukraine do want is actually rather simple. It's for the Russians to leave. And I think we've heard that time and time again. It's that the Russians are the aggressors. They're invading Ukrainian territory. They have been doing so since 2014. And so what the Ukrainian people want is peace. What the Ukrainian people want is integration into the Western family of European countries, into the West and the family of European countries. That has been the goal since I said 2014 with the Revolution of Dignity, and I think it remains the goal now, and that's what we've seen. And I think many of the controversial issues that we've seen regarding territorial concessions or not, which again, people of Ukraine or to decide on, is reflecting of that matter of that the people of Ukraine want the Russians to leave.
The people of Ukraine want the Russians to leave, but how do you sense the feelings are in regards to the territorial concessions? Because from the conversations that I have had, the feelings are quite divided in terms of being able to achieve peace. Because I also wanted to ask, is it Europe that will pave the way to a peace deal for Ukraine and Russia? And how will they do that?
Yes, this is a politically fraught issue, particularly in Ukraine, and I think that is the biggest debate that we're going to watch in the near term. I will note that peace negotiations are not happening right now, so the question I think is actually quite far away. And to be clear, peace negotiations are not happening right now because of Vladimir Putin and the Russian side, which has shown just no willingness to come to any sort of table or any sort of peace talks at all. You've seen the letter that President Zelensky has sent to President Putin just a couple days ago, earlier in June, offering peace talks. President Zelensky, that is, has repeatedly offered talks and plans. And the Russians have rebuffed all of them. We're still waiting and seeing the reports that the Russians might fire an inter-range ballistic missile at the Ukrainians. That is not a sign that the Russians want peace. So I think first and foremost, we're pretty far off from the negotiating table. And I think what role the Europeans have to play is it will be a role that primarily the Ukrainians will have to play at the negotiating table, but the Europeans will play a critical role here. And I'm thinking of the recent E3 meeting that we just watched earlier in June, which President Zelensky joined, which reiterated that Europeans will play a role in any sort of peace in Ukraine. And even they also referenced the issue of territorial concerns. And I think their statement is a good starting point from which to work on, that the current line of contact should be the starting point for negotiations, and international borders cannot be changed by force.
I just
So I think
wanted to
that's a
ask,
very good start for any sort of negotiation.
on the back of the E3 setup, we know that the ambassadors of Germany, France, and the UK met with Sergei Lavrov's deputy in Moscow this week. No one wants to comment on that. No one wants to speak about any details. No one really wants to give an opinion on that. Are you willing to say something about what you think that might be about, whether that might be a stepping stone to something further on later this week, later this month?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to comment on anything that might have happened in the meeting, but I have two hopes. And that is, one, the first hope is that any sort of meetings that happen at any level is coordinated with the Ukrainian government. So I hope that they are in the loop and aware of these sort of meetings. And then point two is that there are no Russian statements or postures around things like NATO or EU membership that they say they might have a veto over. Russia does not get a veto over these decisions and things like membership or security architecture or things like that. So those are my two hopes, are the things that maintain in any sort of meetings, past, present, or future.
Okay, James Batchik, Associate Director at the Atlantic Council. Thanks so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap for World Talks here on TVP World. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you very soon. Goodbye.